Greetings. So I've been getting requests to make more videos about horror movies. I guess that's what you guys really want to see. So there was something that happened this week in the world of horror that didn't get a lot of attention, but it did make all of the major horror sites, Fangoria, Shock Till You Drop, FearNet, Bloody Disgusting, Dread Central, all those. If you're a horror fan, you probably know those websites. And it had to do with this film, DeadGirl. Briefly, I'll just talk about this. As anyone who knows horror knows at this point, zombies are very popular right now, and this film came out a couple years ago. What was it, 2009? Yeah. So this film came out back then, and independent film, and it had a pretty interesting twist on the zombie genre. Normally, when you see a zombie film, they're sort of like a zombie apocalypse type thing, like a Dawn of the Dead, or even a comedy like Zombieland, or it's about sort of like a small outbreak. I guess Shaun of the Dead would probably fit into that category. But this was not about a zombie outbreak or a zombie apocalypse. There's only one zombie in the film, the title character. And what it's about is basically these teenage boys who are sort of playing around this abandoned hospital, and in the basement they find a female zombie. Now, one of the boys has a little bit more moral fortitude. He's pining after the girl at his high school. He's kind of got a little unrequited love there going on. And so the film sort of mixes in that sort of coming-of-age tale with the zombie stuff, and there's a little bit of a rape-revenge genre in here as well. But one of the kids has a little bit more morals, the other one does not, and decides to use the zombie as his sort of like personal sex slave or whatever, and eventually brings in another kid from the high school. And it's sort of an interesting take on the genre, where instead of the zombie being the monster of the film, the real monster are the human characters who are using this dead girl for their own, prurient interest or whatnot, and so the humans are the real monsters. And it's sort of an odd sort of feminist take on the horror film, where it sort of paints a bad portrait of teenage boys, as far as, we all know teenage boys are extremely horny and want sex, but I'm not sure how many would, if given the opportunity, would end up, raping a zombie. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was once a teenage boy, and I certainly had fantasies that I'd have a girl who I could have sex with anytime I want, but she was, living and had a personality and was consensual in my fantasies. It wasn't a rotting corpse, which is sort of an odd, I don't know, even though she's dead and it's kind of necrophilia, she's still semi-sentient, so it still counts as rape, I think. But it's just kind of an interesting film, because it sort of looks at the dark side of humanity, and is sort of very misanthropic in that sense. And I like how it mixes sort of the high school coming-of-age, budding teen sexuality along with the unrequited love, and mixes it with this very dark tale of just men who are just using this empty vessel of a woman for their own desires and base sexual drives. And it's just very... It's very dark and very pessimistic toward human nature, and yet also kind of feminist in its own way, and how it portrays, I guess, sort of the darkest, worst parts of male sexual desire. But an interesting film, and I'd certainly recommend it. The only problem I had is that normally when I go to a site called joblo.com, joblo.com, and they usually have this upcoming DVD or Blu-ray releases that go a few months in advance, and I use that to add things to my Amazon wishlist. And unfortunately, when I added this to my wishlist, because I had read articles about it from playing at film festivals and ended up being a blind buy, I didn't watch it before I bought it, but they linked to the R-rated version when the actual theatrical cut and the major cut is unrated, so I actually haven't seen it as the filmmakers intended. I've only seen this R-rated version, and while I do like the film, I'm not sure I'd watch it enough to do a double dip and buy the unrated version now. So keep that in mind, that I've only seen this R-rated version, which even then was, wait for this to focus here, strong aberrant sexuality, graphic nudity, bloody violence, and pervasive language, yeah. But it's a pretty good film. I'd definitely recommend it. It's worth a look, and it's just very unique. There aren't a lot of zombie films that are like this. It's got a little bit of Lord of the Flies, a little bit of I Spit on Your Grave, a little bit of John Hughesy stuff even. It's interesting. But that brings me back to the new thing that happened this week. So I was reading, I usually peruse the horror sites every now and then for upcoming films I might want to see. For instance, there was a movie that came out this month in limited release called The Divide. It hasn't opened in my state. I probably won't be able to see it till it's on video, but I was looking up information on that because that seemed interesting to me. And there was an article about the guy who wrote this film. His name is Trent Haaga, or Trent Haaga. I don't know if that will focus there. Yeah, Trent Haaga, or Trent Haaga. And apparently, I wasn't aware of how successful this film was financially. I know that it got very positive reviews within the horror community, but I didn't know how much money it made. But apparently it was successful enough that there was some sequel talk about the film. And I guess they went through all the motions, and the project fell apart. The writer, he basically, he didn't go into great detail about it. But apparently it got to the point where he did have a finished screenplay, or at least a pretty clean, spiffy early draft of the screenplay. And what he decided to do is, since the project fell apart and it's not going to be made, at least not with his blessing, he posted his screenplay for DeadGirl 2 online. So you can actually just download it and read it. Myself, it was downloadable in a PDF file. And what's cool about that is I have a Kindle, which of course you can upload PDF files to the Kindle, so I just put the screenplay for DeadGirl 2 up on my little Kindle, and I read it. It's 100 pages, so that's usually a page of a screenplay is equal to about a minute of screen time, so it would have been about an hour and a half, an hour and 40 minutes, whatever. And so I read the screenplay, and I actually think it's quite good. It's got a lot of dark humor in it. Very small cast of characters. It could have been done very cheaply. There's some interesting makeup effects that I'm not sure how they would have been able to pull off on a limited budget, but it would have been interesting to see. The sequel sort of goes into a little bit of a different direction from the first film, whereas the first film is sort of about men who are using the dead girl for their own desires. This is about a woman who's using the dead girl, but not technically for a sexual desire. She's using it more as like revenge or an outlet for her anger. Where basically there's sort of an overweight, homely woman who likes to go out and get drunk every night. She's driving down the road, she hits the dead girl, thinks she's responsible for the wounds and whatnot, brings her home, one thing leads to another, and she ends up getting chained up in the barn, and the woman is using the dead girl to sort of take out her anger on the other people of her small hick town who have denigrated her for years. And it's very dark. It's very dark, and yet has a lot of dark humor in it, and it's very interesting. I would have liked to have seen it as a film. It's a shame that the project fell apart and didn't get made. But I like the fact that a lot of films end up in development hell, or they just don't get made for one reason or another. And then you never know. I mean, those writers probably, if they have a finished script and they spend all of that time and all of that energy working on something, and then it's all for nothing. It only gets read by their agent or a couple people at the studio or whatnot. It's forgotten. But in this age of the internet, where anybody can just upload anything they want as a file, it's kind of interesting when a writer is like, all right, well, I spent my time writing this. They probably went through a few drafts. This says first draft completed, even though it's pretty polished for a first draft. And, they spent all this time, and then no one gets to enjoy it. At least this case, the project fell apart. It's not going to be made, at least not with his involvement. Maybe the studio or whatever that owns it might go off in their own different direction and make some direct-to-video piece of shit or whatever. But at least now people can read it and enjoy it and see what might have been. And of course, I mean, screenplays leaking online for films is really nothing new. I know the original screenplay for Scream 2 leaked online, and so it had to be changed pretty quickly when it was in production. And sometimes screenplays for films leak pretty much all the time, but usually those are films that end up getting made anyway, or that will end up in theaters a few months later. But it's sort of interesting when complete projects fall apart and then you see the screenplay online. And there are a few notable examples of screenplays for films that never get made but end up online anyway. The screenplay for Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon movie, that's online. That's a pretty long one too. That was like 220 pages, and I haven't actually read it. I sort of skimmed it when I downloaded it. There were a couple screenplays for films David Lynch was going to make that ended up online. One was called One Saliva Bubble, another was called Ronnie Rocket. Those were pretty interesting. The Wachowski brothers, the guys who made The Matrix, and then nothing else good after that. They wrote a screenplay called Plastic Man. That's readily available online. You can Google any of these and you'll be able to find them. Prior to Mary Harron and Guinevere Turner adapting the novel American Psycho into a film, which eventually got made with Christian Bale as the star, it was originally going to be adapted as a film to be directed by Oliver Stone, with Leonardo DiCaprio playing Patrick Bateman, if you can believe that. And so there was a different screenplay that was written for that version, and that screenplay is available online, and I haven't read that completely either. But it's waiting on my computer for me to read it. I've just never gotten around to it. But it is sort of interesting. I don't know who ends up leaking those, whether it's just some agent or some script writer who was at a studio and just got bored and was like, this is never going to get made, I'll put it up online anyway. Or if it's just the actual writers, the producers themselves who put it online because, they're trying to get revenge of the executives who ended up putting brakes on the green light there. But this is sort of interesting where just the writer, things fell apart, the writer was upset about... I mean, he didn't go into details, but it was pretty clear that he had some problems with maybe the producers or whatever. And so he was like, you know what, I spent my time writing this, you might as well just let people read it and see if they decide whether it was worth making or not. And so it's pretty cool just to see this sort of what might have been sequel to this rather interesting film. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That doesn't happen all that often when films fall apart. You don't really see the writer actually going out and putting it online themselves. I wish that would sort of happen more often, because every now and then you might read in the trades or whatnot about some interesting film project, and then either the financing doesn't come through, or the studio decides that they didn't want to spend that much money on it, or sometimes even a film will fall apart and then later it'll be made cheaper, like Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain. He was originally going to make that as a pretty high-budget film with Brad Pitt as the star. Brad Pitt ended up dropping out. The film lost financing and ended up getting made with a cheaper budget and a different cast later on down the road. And then, though the original screenplay for that one, before they made the budget cuts, was turned into a comic book, which I've read, and it's pretty similar to what ended up getting made anyway. But it would be sort of interesting to see how the original vision changes from... like the screenplay that was greenlit versus if there were changes made to the shooting script, and then compare that to the finished film. I like doing stuff like that. Sometimes they're actually officially published. Like Quentin Tarantino wrote the original screenplay for Natural Born Killers, but then Oliver Stone took it over, and he had some other people rewrite it. And so the finished film of Natural Born Killers is very, very different in structure, in... who the focus of the film is on from Quentin Tarantino's, and Tarantino's original script would have been very interesting, especially if he had ended up directing it instead. But even though I do like Oliver Stone's finished film, he decided to make it a little bit more sort of a satire of the media and focus it more on Mickey and Mallory, whereas Tarantino's original screenplay focused a little bit more on the Robert Downey Jr. Character, or what was the name, Wayne something? I forget the character's name. But yeah, so I just wanted to make that little video. Dead Girl, definitely worth seeing if you haven't. It sort of flew under the radar, but horror fans themselves sort of picked it up. It didn't get a lot of mainstream attention. And then if you like the film, I'll post the link in the description of this video. You'll be able to go and download and read the screenplay. Again, it's only 100 pages, and screenplays are a lot more of a faster read than a book because the descriptions are different and it's a lot of dialogue. So if for anyone here who's never read a screenplay before. But yeah, that's about it.